Hello, I'm Phoebe Boucher, Managing Editor of Raven Chronicles Press. And thank you for joining us for Raven Talk, Raven's online podcast. We are hosting monthly conversations with writers, artists, cultural warriors. Today, writer Allison Green is talking to Rebecca Brown about her recent publication from Chatwin Books, You Tell the Stories You Need to Believe, a rich celebration of every facet of life viewed through the cycle of the seasons. Here's the book.
Okay.
A book you can carry easily around in your purse or on the bus or train. There will be time for audience questions. If you have a comment or a question, put it in chat and we will, ask them, or we'll have live questions at the end. I want to thank Jack Straw and Levi Fuller for our tech engineer this evening, Tom Stiles. First, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy their land. Thanks to our co-sponsors for partial funding of our Raven programs, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, For Culture King County, Washington State Arts Commission with NEA funding, which funds our projects from them, and always to all our individual donors and supporters. Rebecca Brown is an American novelist, essayist, playwright, artist, and teacher. She was the first writer in residence at Richard Hugo House, the co-founder of the Jack Straw Writers Program, and served as the creative director of literature at Centrum in Port Townsend from 2005 to 2009. She is the author of many books published in the U.S. and in translation, including The Gifts of the Body, which won a Lambda Literary Award in 1994, and Not Heaven, Somewhere Else, The Dogs, a Modern Bestiary, and The Terrible Girls. She lives in Seattle. Allison Green earned an MFA in creative writing and literature from Emerson College in Boston. Back in Seattle at age 30, Allison began her career at Highline Community College, where she has enjoyed teaching writing for more than a quarter of a century. St. Martin's Press published her novel Half Moon Scar as part of its Stonewall Inn Editions imprint. And Ooligan Press, I assume it's Ooligan, rhymes with Ooligan Press in Portland State University, published her memoir, The Ghosts Who Travel With Me, which is a wonderful book. I love that book. Her essays, stories, and poems have appeared in publications such as Zizhava, Willow Springs, Raven Chronicles, The Rumpus, and Yes Magazine. Allison, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Phoebe and Tom. And I just want to take a moment to just thank all of you at Raven Chronicles for doing such amazing work for this community of writers and readers. You're such an important part of this community, and thank you. And thank you to Rebecca for inviting me into this conversation, and all of you who've joined us today. And it's fun to see a lot of folks I know in the participant list, so thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, it's 4 essays, 1 for each season. So it's about life and death and hope and despair, about growing up and aging. And I have read it several times. I really love it. And it does what I think great essays do. It's like having a conversation with a really brilliant, thoughtful, interesting person. There's this intimacy with a mind, at least a mind as created on the page. And it's full of striking sentences. As I was reading it, I just kept stopping to read out loud. And to me, that's what makes great essays. So Rebecca's going to read a little bit to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Allison, so much. It's you honor me by agreeing to be here and chatting with me. It's great as always to work with you. And also thank you, Phoebe, for introducing both of us. In Raven Chronicles, Phoebe, I was just going back over our history, going back to the 90s, and the sort of when Raven Chronicles was beginning, at the end of last century, and just this era of new stuff happening in Seattle. So
remember Red Sky Poetry? You were there at Red
exactly, right? And when it was down at the market, and then when it was down on 14th, and just these different eras, and it's like, and there's something about like still here doing the work, and also expanding the work and welcoming new folks in, and just being part of this amazing sort of tapestry and history that Northwest writing and publishing is. So it's nice to see you here again, old gal. So anyway, thank you. So I want to start reading just a little bit from this book, just so you can kind of get a sense of, I guess, what it sounds like. I think because we're in the beginning of May, but it doesn't actually feel like summer yet. I'm going to read something from the beginning of summer, sort of to get us in the mood. And then I'll read some other different passages as well. And as Allison says, it's a book with 4 major chapters going through the seasons. And then there's a conclusion at the end. Okay, when summer is coming, you start to see ads for tanning booths and how to lose weight and get in shape so you look good in a bathing suit. By summer, you need to be beautiful. No wonder I don't like summer. One summer, I went to a cabin near the coast. I teach from autumn to spring, and sometimes I pretend that when summer comes, I'll get back to my own work and write. Sometimes I do, but it seems to get harder and harder. The summers get shorter and hotter, and more I want a nap. My brain feels like soup. In the cabin, there was a mattress and a toilet and a hot plate and a sink, but the shower was at a place at the end of the parking lot. Outside, past the trees, kids played at the beach while their mothers and dads sat on chairs beneath umbrellas and slathered on suntan lotion. Teenagers got on boogie boards, and some of them even surfed. They strutted around with their fit, tan, hairless bodies, all glistening with oil. I stayed in my cabin away from them and dozed in and out of a big, fat biography of a chubby, eccentric writer. I liked being in a beautiful place and not getting out of bed to go be outside in it. I loved knowing people were all around, but not having to talk or listen or be nice to anyone or pretend I was happy. At night, after most of the day visitors had gone, I walked in town. There wasn't a restaurant or a bar, just a bunch of smallish houses with satellite dishes and stuff in the yard and trucks. Sometimes people would look out their windows at me, but nobody ever said anything, including me. Summer was different when I was a kid. The summer was like it was not even really real, or not just a time, but an actual place you could go to, where school and homework and parents and not knowing how to look never even happened. Summer was riding bikes. One summer, when I was a kid, that song, The Door into Summer, came out on Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited, the 4th album by the Monkees. Before we came back to the States, when we lived in Spain, when my dad was in the Navy, there was mostly the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But after we came back, there was TV after school and the Monkees and Paul Revere and everyone telling you about astrology. You were supposed to be able to figure out secret things about yourself and planets, such as who you were compatible with. I knew what my sign was, and I guessed I was kind of like it, but all the signs, depending on how you thought about them or who was telling you, could kind of apply. I didn't believe in them, but I was curious about who could be compatible with me. Could anyone? I tried to ask someone their sign one time, as if it were no big deal, but then I didn't know what to say next. I didn't know how to say anything or how to stand in my skin anymore. The summer was crabgrass beneath your feet. You felt it on the sides of your flip-flops and sticky white broken stems of ripened figs. It was the smell of chlorine and suntan lotion at the pool. It was the smell in the bathroom of Clearasil and aftershave when your brother began to shave. The grass in the summer was hot as steam, but cooler in the evening. In the evening, when fathers got home from work or brothers from summer jobs, there was the sound of the lawnmower choking, then revving, then whirring across the lawn. Then there was the smell, then the same sound at somebody else's, then somebody else's house. The fathers wore baseball caps and shirts. The brothers went shirtless, and you could see their shoulder arm muscles move and the zits on their backs. Tina and Tammy wanted to stop and get off our bikes and talk to the boys. Lydia and the boys and I did not. Summer is sweet until you meet someone or find something you maybe think is love and lose or throw or give away whatever sense you have been starting to imagine. Whatever sense of you have been starting to imagine. Something has started inside of you, inside your skin, and you want to do things, but you don't want, but then you do. You want to go off alone or with somebody, but not just anybody else. You'd love for this person to look at you, but you would be more frightened if they did. Will they? Why won't they look at you? What's wrong with you? Can everybody see? Everyone else knows how to look. You don't. We're going to move on to the fall now. Jumping from that idea of like summer's when you start feeling things, and fall is a season when someone can fall out of love. It's gradual and sad or wild and thrashing, but always a beginning of an end. Was it something you did? A way you became disappointing? Or were you just stupid to think someone could love you? Did someone who once considered you novel get bored? Had they been mistaken to think you were worthy of love? Were you a fool to hope you maybe were? What's wrong with you? Or how can one not love the way one did? What did you mean when you said, I love you? Why did you tell the things you did? But someone falls out, so you must too, or act as if you have, like everything's fine. You're fine, as if you're no longer a child or think like one, or think or hope you could prevent or undo what has changed. Inside, you are broken and partly dead, but you can't die just yet. You have to pretend you're fine. You have, even you, your pride. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Yeats wrote The Second Coming in 1919, just after the end of World War I, and after he'd lost his faith in the Irish Republican Brotherhood's attempts to peaceably create an independent Ireland. The war to end all wars had not ended war. The dream of returning to a traditional Irish past had proven, if not impossible, naive. The state of before can't be restored. All things fall apart in time. When blood is let, it can't unlet. The fallen have fallen finally. They're dead. The darkness drops again, the poem goes on. Yeats believed that history repeats itself in cycles. And what rough beast, he asks at the end of the poem, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. History cycles in gyres like the seasons of the year. After the darkness falls, there comes a time to rest. Then after a time, something else begins, an innocent or a Jesus or a rough and slouching beast. Then there is spring and light again, then fall, then dark again, again, again. So hopefully those two sections will give you a sense of a little bit how the book is structured and the kinds of ways it mixes personal feelings, autobiography, and then trying to understand things through thinking about poetry and music and history. So anyway, there's that. So let's chat, Allison.
Wow. Phew. Yeats right now, these days, right? All these things happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think from those beautiful passages about those halting new emotions to these world events and terrifying things that were also part of our lives. Yeah. Okay, well, I came up with 4 questions, one for each season, and I hope folks will also ask questions. And so 4 questions to kind of spark conversation. So I have a spring question. The title of the book comes from the spring essay, You Tell the Stories You Need to Believe. So can you tell us something about your beginnings as a writer? Were there stories you needed to tell because you needed to believe them? What were you writing, or why? Or were there literary traditions you saw yourself as part of? So any of those avenues, beginnings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thanks, Allison. And again, thanks for doing this. Anyway. So literary beginnings, for me, I wanted to be a writer since I was a little girl, right? Like I remember when I was in 8 years old in 3rd grade class, and I took vocabulary words and turned them into a story, right? So it was just, I was that kind of little girl. And I kept, I was a little kind of girl that like had journals, and I wrote in journals, and I just always wanted to be a writer. But it wasn't, but I don't come from a family of artists particularly. I come from a white middle-class family, and we received college. I mean, we went to college and high school, but it wasn't like being an artist wasn't like, let's go for it. But having said that, my mom was really encouraging. She's like, do whatever you need to be happy, but also you should learn how to type because you'll need to be a secretary, or you need something to fall back on, quote. And I've supported myself partly as a writer throughout my life, but also as a teacher like you. So it's like, instead of falling back on being the female job of a secretary, falling back on the artist job of being a teacher, right? But having said that, I've loved teaching very, very much. But I wanted to write since I was a little kid. I studied literature as an undergraduate, and then I got an MFA in creative writing. And I know that in some way, I mean, I actually really believe in MFA programs. I've taught them for years. But there's for a lot of people, there's this kind of like, oh, real writers don't need that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, easy for you to say. I mean, I remember hearing different friends, but I didn't need to do that because I could just meet writers. I was like, well, maybe you met writers because you lived in New York, or maybe you met writers because your parents were academics, or maybe whatever. But it's like, I was like a kid in the shitty suburbs. Like, we didn't have artists around. So it's kind of like, for me, graduate school was a great place to learn and a great place to meet other writers and to just be around people that love and encourage writing and reading in the arts. And essentially that became a kind of model for the rest of my life. And like, many of my friends are writers or artists, or writer, artist, activists, right? And so for me, being a student of writing through university was a big part of it. My first book came out when I was 28. It was part of my graduate thesis. It came out in England. I couldn't find publishers here for many, many years. So a strange publishing history, but basically since '84, I've been writing and publishing. And for many years, I also supported myself doing part-time office work or part-time house cleaning or, bartending. But then the last probably 20 years, I've been able to support myself as a teacher and a writer. So that's kind of where I came from. And in terms of where I came from as a writer and reader. My mom read fairy tales to me. I'm still really into fairy tales. And it's very much a kind of Western European canon. As a kind of white middle-class American, that's my roots, right? And I talked about Ireland in this essay, and my family is big part in Irish, and so that the Irish storytelling tradition is a big part of my sort of genetic background. And I was also a kid who grew up in the 60s, so pop music was just profoundly important to me. Mm-hmm. And the notion of being a living artist, I really got through pop music rather than through books. But like, I was that little girl who wanted to be the fifth Beatle. So anyway, so is that spring enough?
Yeah, that's spring. That's good.
Yeah. Can I send it back to you, Allison? Tell me about your spring as a writer. Can you do that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's not that different, except that my parents were academics. So, I was reading and writing from a young age. My favorite books when I was a kid were Alice in Wonderland, which my parents read to me, and A.A. Milne's book of poems when we were very young.
Right.
And I still have some of those memorized, and I really think there was this sense, both Lewis Carroll and A.A. Milne, this sense of wonder, and also a sense of language, right? That just the music of it, I wanted to do that.
Right. Right.
And I had the advantage of when I was writing poetry in high school and college, and then I was lucky to have parents who said, you should get an MFA. And how many people's parents say you should get an MFA? And I hadn't really heard of it or thought of it. And also to have the privilege to do that, right? And I had a pretty mediocre experience in my MFA program, but I got the credential to teach at community college, and I got to live in Boston for a while, and so it was, so reading and writing were from the early on, for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, because we're both, we're not quite 10 years difference, but we're both like middle-class white American women, and we grew up, and so our sort of literary heritage of like fairy tales and Disney and A.A. Milne, that kind of American mainstream kind of thing happening. But we're also, I'm 66 plus, and so coming up as an out lesbian in the 80s, that's when it was like, where was my literary tradition in that, right? And I know that from your memoir that Phoebe just referenced, the Ghosts That Travel With Us, that a lot of that memoir is about like, why, as a young woman becoming a lesbian, why was I drawn to Richard Brautigan, right? I said, I loved your memoir, but I tried to go back and read Richard Brautigan. I can't do it. I just can't do it. But this thing about like where we look and find something, right? Like a lot of the things I was drawn to, I wouldn't be drawn to them now in terms of aesthetics or politics or whatever, but something inside me was drawn to what I had at the time, right? We didn't have a gay and lesbian studies thing, there weren't, I remember when I was in graduate school, there was this great big brouhaha about like, would they hire this guy because he was an out homosexual? And it was like, and it's like, dude, you forgot that's not that long ago, right?
Right.
And people would like, why isn't so-and-so working here? Oh, something came up. It's like, oh, he was outed. And so this thing of what it was like for you and me to grow up in an era in which part of our context, or sort of part of our context as out queer people, was to create that heritage, right? And so part of spring is like finding where you can fit in, and also like, where do I not fit in? What do I have to create? One of the books I'm reading now is Jed Pearl, a critic I picked up at the library, but I think it's called like Authority and Freedom. Anyway, he's talking about like art being not political. It's like, easy for you to say. But he talks about artists working in forms and always trying to push them out, whether it's aesthetically or politically or something. And you take what you're given, and then like, how can I live in this thing? So how could we as, Americans, women, queers, whatever.
Mm-hmm. You know, you anticipated my summer question, which was about being queer and being a writer. And I reread The Terrible Girls for this event because I think this was my first book of yours that I read. And it would have been early 90s that I read it. I was just out of my MFA program. And that's one of the reasons my MFA program was so mediocre, was there wasn't a queer literary tradition, even though there was.
Right.
You know, we were reading Walt Whitman and we were reading Elizabeth Bishop, but no discussion of that.
Right.
And you're The Terrible Girls. And if you have not read The Terrible Girls, I highly recommend. It's these gothic, Kafkaesque stories about lesbians making their lovers suffer. I mean,
there you go. That's a Rebecca Brown book for you.
And you know, it's so weird, it's so strange and so good. Like, it's so, like, I have held in my brain all these years, you know, the beginning of this story, the one says to the other, I would give my right arm for you. And she says, thank you, I'll take it. And the rest of the story is she has no arm and she's bleeding and scabbing over. I mean, it's just, and for me, it was like, and you know, you're just enough ahead of me. I think that was true for me, that it was like, oh, I was thinking of a line, you know, there were other lesbian writers I was reading, right? There was this flowering of lesbian feminist publishing at the time. I was reading Audre Lorde, I was reading Dorothy Allison, and you were just part of that. There was a line in your summer essay about, I felt lonely about what I wanted. And I think I felt lonely about what I wanted as a queer writer in my MFA program. And I think your books were part of what made me see that there weren't limits on what I could do as a lesbian writer.
Well, that's great to hear, Allison. And there's no greater compliment that a writer can get, right? One, to be read, and two, to be read by a writer who says, your books helped me think I could do more or branch out further. And having said that, I mean, in my experience, like the mid 80s, Judy Grahn was a writer that I read in high school, an amazing poet. Dorothy Allison hadn't published yet. Audre Lorde was, you know, a great figure and actually came to my graduate school. And so that generation slightly above me were around. And then in the 1980s, there was a lot of lesbian feminist publishing here in the States. And there was a real propensity for the lesbian feminist publishing in the 80s to be realistic, and also coming out narratives, and also narratives about coming out and very sort of politically aware of, like, coming out and we're done with the patriarchy and now we're lesbians and so things are good. And my stuff was like, actually these lesbians are just like horrible to each other. I mean, they're like horrible stories. And my work wasn't actually published in this country for many years. And my first 4 books were published in England first. And then after they were published in England, they came out over here. So even within a thing of, within a few years, the sort of publishing climates can change drastically. And, you know, work that might not be out 1 year, wait 5 years and it'll come out great. Or other things, you publish something and nobody notices, and then 10 years later, someone's like, why didn't you write a book like blah, blah, blah? Well, actually, I did in 2009, but go ahead and try to read it now. And so partly it's a sort of being part of the world, and then trying to be in step with the world. Just as a writer, where do you fit in, I guess, time-wise, right? That's pretty vague. I don't know where that was going, but yeah, we grew up in a very exciting boom time for the beginning creation and flowering of gay and lesbian publishing. And there were a lot of women's publishing houses, a couple of lesbian publishing houses, and a few gay men's publishing houses. But of course, in the 80s, the gay men didn't have to go to small presses because there were a lot of gay men working in the Men on Men series, and trying to remember some of these, Richard Labonte, some of these gay guys were able to get into the publishing mainstream before the women were. Some great, wonderful editors of that era. It's years ago. It's 30 years ago.
Phoebe is asking if Virginia Woolf was a writing mentor for you.
I love Virginia Woolf's work. I first read her when I was 18. The first book I read of hers was Orlando. And you're like,
I loved Orlando.
Right? Like, you can't do better than that. Like, written in 1928. And it's like, yo, this guy turns into a woman in the middle of the book and nobody notices because it's like, yeah, whatever. I mean, people notice if they're not like freaked out. They're like, yeah, it was a guy, now I'm a woman. Live with it. Next. And funny and smart and scathing about, all sorts of things. So huge fan of Woolf. And then the sort of quote, more serious books, to my mind, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse are some of the great artistic masterpieces of the 20th century. And A Room of Her Own is one of the great philosophical, political masterpieces of the early 20th century. But I'm a little cautious of saying like, oh yeah, I've been influenced by Virginia Woolf. It's kind of like, yeah, my sentences are kind of as good as hers. Like, nobody can say that, but I can happily talk about writers I love, right? And writers who like said, you can do whatever the fuck you want, right? Yeah. You want to do like a 3-page long sentence. If you can make it make sense, go for it. If you want to do like a 10-page chapter where nothing happens except dust falls, go for it. And if you want to kill the mother off in the middle of the chapter, do it in a parenthesis. You can do that. And so Woolf is kind of like she does all sorts of things that one shouldn't be able to do, but now we can because she did it, right? And I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge, huge fan. And I, I definitely like when I've gone to London, I go see like the Virginia Woolf sites. I also go to the Mary Shelley sites, like, oh, Mary Shelley lived here, died here, like, oh, this is where Percy and Mary had their first kiss. Oh, it's just like, so I'm a fan. It's like I'm a fan of like, oh my God, Ethan Wharton lived here, let's go. So yeah, writers I love. She's definitely one of them.
Yeah. I went to London and and followed the route that Mrs. Dalloway took in her day.
Yes.
And when I was standing there reading a passage out about Big Ben ringing, Big Ben rang right at that moment. It was
right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So my fall question is about, you talk about Frank Sinatra in the fall section, and you talk about how the autumn of your years, you like that phrase. Like you feel like in middle age is really not it, right? You're really in the autumn of your years. So I was wanting you to say something about looking, but you have this amazing body of work, right? Do you feel like your sense of your aesthetic or your style has changed? Do you think it's changing now as you're older?
I actually do. I do think it is continuing to change, right? I mean, like this last book, You Tell the Stories You Need to Believe. I'm really proud of this book. I like it. I stand by it. And I'm like, good. And it's very different from like The Terrible Girls, right? From Terrible Girls was from 90 or 91 in England came out first. They're really different books. Mm-hmm. I think, and there's a lot of range in my work. Like some of it is like really almost Hemingway-esque monosyllabic, or rhythmically like Richard Stein, but some of it's like Gothic and weird like Kafka you referenced. Mm-hmm. There's one book that's got like fairy tales in it. And there's a real range of stuff. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm 66, right? And so, I hope to kiss a pig. I'm not fucking alive in 30 years. And don't expect to be the Browns and the Wildmans aren't long-lived people, but I do have a couple more books I want to do. And so I'm definitely and this year, in a couple of months, I will be retired from my teaching job. And so I feel like, slowing down. But I do have a couple more books that I've done that I want to turn into a book to get out in the world before I stop doing things. And so I do feel like, since like, oh, I can look back and say, I did that. I'm really proud of that. Or like, could have done that better. or gosh, should I write about that? Because it seems to me like I just want to kind of correct the history on something. I no, just forget about it. So I definitely feel like I'm heading towards the end, right? It's like neither of my parents made it to 75, so I got to get cracking if I want to get this shit done. So yeah, but I'm retiring from teaching, but as I was realizing today, it's like I haven't retired from writing yet because there's things I need to do, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely in the fall.
In the fall, yeah.
Yep.
So my winter question is, you wrote these pre-COVID pandemic, and the afterword of the book talks a little bit about that. And I wonder if you'd say a little more about how you look back at this book from our collective COVID winter.
Right.
Which isn't over.
Well, so the book, the individual essays were commissioned by the stranger. At first, Christopher Frizzell commissioned one that was like, oh, let's do another one. And so they took place over a number of years. And Trump was the president for a while. And when I set off writing them, I didn't know I was writing a long book about seasons. And I mean, at one point in an early draft of an essay, there's something about like, my wife will soon be the age that, it was just like, oh, I'm past that age. My wife's older than me, but it's like, I'm past that age now. So that a couple of years had passed between writing the essays and then putting them together. And the print world changed a lot, publishing changed a lot. So it's kind of like, even in the course of writing these essays, I'm seeing changes just in my personal life and in my sort of professional world of print, media, journalism, writing, teaching, right? And then there was COVID and there was Trump, and it was just like, it was kind of like, well, I'm just happy to die anytime now. Just fucking, we're done with this shit. And then Ferguson happened, and the murders of Black people, and it was just like, okay, let's just blow up the world now. This is just really fucking. However, then, and I thank Donald Trump for this. We got the Me Too movement, and we got Black Lives Matter, and those things were like, we're not dead yet. Younger people, younger women, and professional women, and women in all walks of life, and Black people. From all walks of life, we're just like saying, okay, now we're going to do this shit. And there's just like this necessary huge explosion of energy, and we're not going to take it. And that energizing thing was so necessary for the world, right? It's like, are we going to end with Trump and COVID? No, we're not. Nor are we going to end from sexual abuse and racial abuse. We're going to fucking turn those babies around, or at least make noise about it, And so that is where the book ends. And for me, it was like, we're not going to end with it's winter, we're just dead. It's like things got really, 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 really bad. And then Me Too and Black Lives Matter said, it's not over. We're coming back. We're going to do it better.
Spring.
It's my hope. Yeah, hope.
Yeah. So Shane has a question. How do you know what it is you still need to write?
Actually, Shane, for me personally right now, I don't know. If there's something else I need to write, I don't know if I need to, or if so, what it is. When I'm talking about 2 more books, in my case, I'm talking about a couple of really almost finished bodies of work that could be books that just kind of didn't get there. And 2 of them I'm pretty far along with that have gone back with years of work. So when I talk about I've got these 2 books to finish, they're like books to finish, not like so I don't have a thing of like, I need to write about, I don't know. I don't know that. and I also don't have a thing of, I don't have that urgency. Like sometimes there's just kind of like nameless, amorphous urgency of like, ugh. It's almost like a writing libido, that I think for years it was just like, it was just kind of like, write this thing. And I don't have that necessity anymore. I don't know. It's a terrible answer. Do you have things you need to write, Allison?
Yes. I mean, I have to say that I kind of went into a COVID hibernation. My writing self went into hibernation. There was a kind of, I think part of it was sort of jumping into needing to take care of my parents. And for other various things, it was just, I pretty much stopped reading for a couple of years. So, but
it's intense, right? That means something, right? Like part of you is just like elsewhere, elsewhere.
Yes. Because I really I teach at a community college. I typically don't write much during the school year, but then the summer comes and then I'm all pent up and I have no trouble writing, right? It's my writing time. I have the psychic space to do it in. And even though I was at home, working from home, the psychic space wasn't there. So it's coming back. Spring is coming back, and this event is helping me like get my brain back in it. But yeah, I have a manuscript that I wrote before COVID that I'd like to pull up back out again, and then I did start writing something related to being my dad's executrix. So yeah, things are happening.
But that kind of thing, like I have a manuscript I want to go back to. They're going to do that, and also like life throws you stuff, right? Like to sort of calmly say, my dad's executrix is like, oh, that's a big deal. Like that's a huge deal, and that's your life now, and that wasn't your life 3 years ago, right. And we don't know what's coming next. I mean, when at some point in your life, you know that people around you will die or you will die, but you don't know what events are going to like come in and say something, right?
You need to write about them.
Yeah. You don't know what's going to happen politically that's going to lead to Black Lives Matter, and think, okay, now I've got to look at the world in this way. We just don't know stuff. Yeah.
So people, put your questions in the chat. We've got time now for more questions.
Yeah. Or raise your hand, or
raise your hand if you want to
ask Rebecca. Great to see an animated person.
Oh, you know what? I just saw Phoebe's thing there. Phoebe's thing in the chat. And that was just one of my favorite topics is Phoebe said, like, remember talking years ago at Red Sky that I couldn't get a grant. I was like, and I'm still grantless, like all those years of applying for Washington State, Seattle Arts Commission,
really?
Arts Trust, never. Washington State, Artist Trust, Seattle Arts Commission. What's the other one? King County. Anyway, and I think, sorry?
Poor culture.
Poor culture knows it. And I think at some point it's kind of like, well, she doesn't need it. And it's like, well, at this point, like I'm 66, so it's not gonna, people like, when you apply for a grant, how will I help a career? Well, it'll pay my rent for like a month, like whatever. And so the idea of like, if it's need-based, because of my age, or like she's done 15 books, she must make lots of money. Well, my royalties are about $300, right? And then there's the other thing of just like, shouldn't she have had one now? She must have had, or people to assume you've got this stuff. I'm like, no, but that's not reason to get a grant that you should have had it 30 years ago. But it does really sour me on the whole thing of government or community or something like that. And one of the things about when Jack Straw was put together, I was vehement about like, send the work, but don't send us like a statement about like how Jack Straw will help my career, or what I'm working on is I want to see fucking work. I don't want to read on the work, right? And so this idea of like the work rather than marketing your work in advance, or talking about how your work will help you or the community. And it's kind of like,
totally agree.
Yeah, and anyway,
that's a great thing. That's a great thing about the Jack Straw writing, the writers.
Yeah, and it was like every year there's a different curator, right? So it's not the same crew. You don't get it this year, maybe you get it next year, because every year is really, really different.
Yeah.
And anyway, so whatever. But
yeah.
So we've got a few questions.
Okay, great. Some questions. Let's go.
Play the game.
Yeah. So Sue wants to know, how do you know when a piece of writing is finished, or do you know ahead of time?
Oh boy. Sometimes I feel like I know, but I'm wrong. I mean, like, for example, this book, which I gave to Phil Beavis at Chatwin Books, I was like, here's the book, we're ready to go. And Phil's like, okay, you need to write a concluding essay. No, it's really clean. It's 4 essays. It's standard. It's like, no, it's really not. And then the more he talked about it, and the more I realized, like, you're right. A version was finished, but the essays are finished, but the book wasn't finished, right? So that's in a big, like, you're right. It's not a book yet without this thing. And other times I've thought things were done. I sent it to my friends, and they're like, a couple of writer friends are like, great, Rebecca, you might not be finished writing yet. I'm like, oh, it really sucks. My friends are going to say it really sucks. They're just like, I'm not sure you're quite there yet. And then 6 weeks later, I'm like, you're right. It's a piece of shit. I shouldn't have sent it to you, but I'm going to go back and do something else. But I still don't have a good sense of my own work, actually. And then sometimes I feel like this is good enough for now, for the deadline, for the word count, right? And I have to say that for me, the most satisfying writing experience recently was there's a place I volunteer for, and they ask volunteers to write little things like, what was your volunteer experience like? And so I just wrote this, and it's more or less anonymous. I mean, people's first names are there, but there's 500 volunteers. So just like, and I wrote this little thing for the volunteer newsletter, and it was kind of like, it did its job. It did its job. Someone said, will you write will you write something short for, and it was like, it just did its job. And, but really in answer to the question, how do I know when something is done? I don't still. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think, I often think it's done when it's not done.
Right.
Yeah. But then if I give it time, it'll sneak into my consciousness what's not working about it.
Yeah, because I want things to be done. I want them done. I want them done. I want to stop working on them. It's like, be done. It's like, well, no, we're not done yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
Kate has a question. How much are you thinking about audience when you write, and how much is just driven by your own interests and questions?
I think audience is kind of a funny thing, and it's changed over the years, because I think for a long time I just wrote, I wrote out of emotion, or really privately, and just very angsty, visceral, emotional stuff. And I kind of did a lot of that, and those things kind of happened in first books. But then some of my other work, for example, my book, The Gifts of the Body, is a book about a home care worker who takes care of people who are dying of AIDS, right? And it's very spare. It's almost monosyllabic. It's very viewed from the outside. And it began as a series of letters to my girlfriend, telling her about things I remembered. But then at some point I couldn't stop writing these things. It was like, I think I'm writing a book. But the sense of so it wasn't a sense of audience, but it was a sense of responsibility to my characters, right? It's like, this is not a book for Rebecca to go gothic or weird sentences, or like, look what I can do stylistically. I'll bet you didn't notice I'm counting syllables in my paragraphs. I'll bet you didn't. It's just like this sort of like Baroque writerly things that I think about. But it was like, it wasn't the audience, but it was like a sense of responsibility to the characters in the story that was like, not about me and my style, but it's about those characters and story. And those kinds of things have happened more in my nonfiction, as a sense of like being responsible for a character or their story. And then other things, when someone will say, will you write something about, for example, someone said, will you write an essay about how movies see us? It was a really cool assignment. So I wrote something that went into a book of mine. And so when I get an assignment, there's a sense of like, what is this editor asking for? And why are they asking me? And how can I do what they're asking for in my mode or something? And so in that sense, there's like an audience of like, what's the editor asking for? Yeah, so I think a sense of the characters and responsibility, and if there's an editor involved. But I certainly am beyond the point of thinking, maybe if I write this a certain way, I'll make some money on this book or sell a book or get a bestseller. I'm too old for that shit. So that's didn't happen yet. It's not going to happen. So, so that.
Yeah. Other questions, folks?
No.
I have other questions I could ask, but
How about
Can I turn it back to you, Allison?
yes.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to that sense of like audience in your memoir, The Ghosts Who Travel With Me.
Mhm.
And a lot of that book is, it's about Brodigan. It's about the West. And Arlene figures a lot in the book.
Mhm.
And so did you have a sense of, was Arlene partly your audience, or was other readers your audience, or was it, because there's a lot of things in there that they're kind of, they're arch about the West and about rural America. But they're not mean, but they're kind of like, she took me to Cuba and I took her to Idaho, just those kind of like, so audience responsibility in that book or others of your works?
So I wrote that book because, and I've got Jennifer and Donna from my writing group who coached me through that book, who it would not be the book it is if it weren't for Jennifer and Donna.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, my first novel came out in 2000 with St. Martin's. And then I wrote another novel and nobody wanted it. And then I wrote, I kept writing novels and not having any success with them. And so there was this moment, I think it was in the 2005, maybe 2006, where I was kind of like, should I keep writing? And there was a sense of like, if I keep writing and nobody publishes it, will I keep writing? And so I just kind of said, okay, I'm not going to think at all about getting published, and I'm just going to do a series of writing exercises. And I took Trout Fishing in America, and I can't remember now off the top of my head why I took Trout Fishing in America, Brodigan's book, but it's these little chapters. And I got up early every morning at 5, and I would read a chapter, and then I would free write a response.
Wow.
So that by the time I was done with that, I had this stuff. And then because my father's family's from Idaho and the trip that Brodigan takes us through Idaho, it all started to come together. But it was Jennifer and Donna who made it interesting to an audience. I mean, I really
Writing buddies, let's hear it for writing buddies.
Exactly. I really had to think about like what orders do things go in, and what kind of coherence is there, if anything, and then I would say in that sense, once I'm later in a project, I am starting to think about audience and in the sense of what does the reader need or want from me in this moment, or how might they read it, that kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, sadly, I wrote a novel about the WTO protests and nobody wanted it, and then somebody else wrote a book about the WTO protests, and got it published. And you always, you never know if it was like my book wasn't good enough or it just the time wasn't right. But
the time was off, right? The time was off.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So someone's asking, how do you feel now about summer, Rebecca?
Me?
Yeah, Willie is asking.
I wish it would get here. I wish it would get here. I, for my impending retirement from teaching, which I can't stop talking about, or just for that phrase, I'll be retired. I'll be retired. Anyway, I bought myself an electric bike. So I'm like, okay, let's go summer. And so summer doesn't bother. I mean, partly it's just like puberty and adolescence is really hard. You're so self-conscious about your body and do I have boyfriends or girlfriends and how am I attractive and just, but like by the time you're past middle age, especially women past middle age, it's like nobody looks at it anyway. Just like relax, eat what you want, stay healthy and just dig it. So summer's fine. I don't like to travel in the summer. When I lived in Europe, summer was awful because there were so many other people traveling to it. But yeah, summer's cool. Summer's cool. Can't wait to do more hiking in my shorts and my t-shirts and my little sun cap and just go for it, and do it now before the glaciers melt.
Right.
So.
Well, on that note, thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Allison.
Allison, Phoebe, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for visiting tonight. What a great conversation. Allison, I'm so glad we did this. And
that was fun.
This was fun. Yeah.
And Phoebe, Kathleen Alcala, and Daniel Olivas coming up.
Next week on the 11th, which is, I think, Wednesday at 7:30. He's an LA lawyer, government lawyer, but he writes funny stuff. And how to date a flying Mexican. It'll be funny. Anyway, Kathleen.
Oh my God.
He's Mexican. And anyway, both Kathleen and he are parents were from Mexico. Anyway, thanks everyone. Loved it. We'll post it's on Facebook right now, but we will post it on our YouTube station soon.
Okay, thanks Phoebe. Thanks Allison. Thanks Tom.
You.
Thanks Allison. Bye. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Love you all.